I'm told that Republicans, to win, must be anti-abortion, anti-gay marriage, for the war on drugs, for stricter immigration controls. Gary Johnson's for none of that. Candidate Johnson isn't even religious. He doesn't go to church. That's unheard of in many conservative circles. Republican strategist Karen Hanratty says that's not going to fly in a Republican primary.
No, it's not going to fly in a Republican primary. I think a lot of it actually isn't going to fly with a lot of mainstream voters, in fact.
What about that? You were going to say, I don't go to church, I don't believe in God?
Well, I don't, no, I don't say that. I believe in God. I don't go to church, but I certainly don't lead with these kinds of things.
Yeah,
I think
but
that
they're going to bring it up.
I think that
they will bring it up,
well,
especially
and that's fair game.
Sure.
It's absolutely fair game. I think I'm not in the minority here when it comes to believing in God and not attending church.
But the reality is, when you go to Iowa and you go to a caucus, there is a very religiously conservative constituency in these early primary voting states.
Absolutely.
That I think are far more religiously conservative than many people even realize. I mean, you know, have you had people lay hands on you and pray, Gary? Because that's a big part of the Republican caucus. That's a big part of the Republican primary, and going to the Voters' Values Summit.
I think, Karen, the Republican candidates go to a caucus and people lay hands on them and pray?
You know, I mean, it's not uncommon, right? This is a very personal connection with them. You know, they often want to hear from Republican candidates. What's your testimony? What's your walk with Christ? What are the values you and I share in common? And I think that's a really important part of connecting with these voters. And I think it's something that you would struggle with.
So you're toast.
Well, no, first of all, I respect the views of a social conservative. I think that 60% of Americans describe themselves as fiscally conservative and socially liberal. Now, I would argue that perhaps it's not socially liberal, that it's really classically liberal, which is the notion that less government is better government. The notion that the best thing that the government can do for me is to let me be the individual that I might be. And as governor of New Mexico, I did that. Maybe there'll end up being 120 candidates running on the Republican side of the ticket. But right now, I think I'm the only candidate that would support a woman's right to choose. And I might add, I support a woman's right to choose up until viability of the fetus. And
when's that?
Well, the court has actually described that as being able to sustain the fetus outside of the womb, even if by artificial means. That is actually the law of the land currently.
So about 20 weeks or so.
I think you'd have a very difficult time getting past a lot of Republican primary voters on that issue, but that's not the only issue.
But before we leave
sure.
it, you said you're in the majority, but that you don't go to church. Don't the majority of Americans go to church or temple or something?
I don't. I think the majority of Americans consider themselves religious, but I don't know if the majority of Americans actually attend church.
But I would say a majority of Republicans in South Carolina, for instance, which is an important primary state, go to church. In fact, if you drive through South Carolina, you'll see something that I certainly did not see living 20 years in California, which is street signs indicating, you know, it's 5 miles to the next church. I mean, these are street signs in South Carolina.
Well, so
it's part of their culture. In an early Republican primary election, you're going to have a difficult time connecting, and that's a big part of getting elected, is connecting with people and having a shared sense of values.
Sure. And I might be wrong, but I happen to think that given that there are 11 or 12 candidates running on the Republican side of the ticket, that I'm going to offer up a choice that doesn't exist anywhere else.
Well, I definitely agree with that. I guarantee you, you're offering the only choice to legalize prostitution, and I guarantee you there's not another candidate, even on the Democratic side, who's going to want to legalize prostitution.
Well, and I've never actually led with the notion of legalizing prostitution. What I've been asked many times is would you legalize prostitution? And my answer to that is that, first of all, I don't have any desire to engage the services of a prostitute, and I never have.
Stipulate.
And I never have. But We already have one state that has done this. And if you were to engage in prostitution, where is it that you would want to engage prostitution? You'd want to do that in Nevada, where it was safe, where it was safe and where it was legal.
Likewise, drugs. You would decriminalize at least marijuana.
Well, I would... I would legalize marijuana, and I say legalize as opposed to decriminalize because I think decriminalize turns its back on half the problem, which is the marketplace. When it comes to all the other drugs, in a nutshell, we should look at the drug problem first as a health issue rather than a criminal justice issue.
But that's not how voters look at it. Voters are not, I would say voters across the board. In fact, if you look at the polls, you don't really have support for legalizing marijuana, even in the Democratic.
Actually, we're just two years away from being at a tipping point on that issue.
But you look at it as a health issue. I think you come at it from a very theoretical, scientific point of view, but I think it's politically tone deaf.
Well, let me tell you my experience with marijuana, that it's not theoretical. I've smoked marijuana, I've drank alcohol, and although I don't do either today, the big difference between marijuana and alcohol is that marijuana is a lot safer. And for the 100 million Americans who smoke marijuana, I think there's a recognition of that.
My last guest took him on skeptically from the right. My next guest, historian Thaddeus Russell, attacks him from the left. So, take it away.
I heard a remarkable thing on Fox News the other night. A politician actually mentioned a study done about the Portugal drug decriminalization policy. For 10 years, all drugs in Portugal have been decriminalized since 2001. And they found that across the board, all the harmful effects of drugs have decreased since that policy was enacted. And
that politician was?
That politician was Gary Johnson.
On Sean Hannity's show.
It was on Sean Hannity's show. But then I looked at Gary Johnson's position on drugs, and actually, as radical as Republicans might think he is, I think he's not radical enough.
Yeah, we didn't really explain it. You propose legalizing marijuana, and that's it. Not the other drugs.
Well, I think that if we legalize marijuana, we will take giant steps forward toward rational drug policy with regard to the rest of the drugs. If we legalized all drugs tomorrow, the world would be a better planet. But I have to tell you, I'm not advocating that.
What's the intellectual logic behind it? Do we own our own bodies once we're adults or not?
That you take this there on that intellectual argument, but that we take the step to legalize marijuana. We do that. We understand that then we come to recognize that the sky isn't going to fall, that things are actually better as a result of doing that. And then we move on and we actually start looking at the rest of the drugs from a harm reduction standpoint, reducing death, disease, crime, corruption. Portugal decriminalized all drugs 10 years ago, and they've shown a 50% reduction in heroin use over the last 10 years. I mean, that kind of flies in the face of logic, but that's what's happened.
So why don't you want to decriminalize all drugs?
If you're going to start off with the whole enchilada, I don't see it happening.
Oh. Well, I think that is the problem. I mean, I think there's two problems that Gary Johnson faces here, and they're coming together. He's the one who cited this Portugal study, 10 years of history, that shows that decriminalizing all drugs does great wonders for society. Unfortunately, he's running within the Republican Party, which is a majority Christian conservatives, and he knows that he simply can't win the primary if he pushes that far on this issue.
I mean, can you blame him? What do you want? Look at the heat he's already taken from Republicans for the mild stance he's taken, and here he is on that show with Sean Hannity.
The idea that America would legalize or go down this road is repugnant to me, because I don't think government should have that role in the moral destruction of a human soul, which is predictable.
Yes, I don't want our kids criminalized.
The moral destruction of the human soul. You want him to push that in the Republican primary?
Well, some people think that's what the Republicans are doing already, but